The Mayo Experience.
That Mayo Experience. That Mayo Experience. That Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, Week 6 DraftKings picks and preview. The cheat sheet for DraftKings will be up on DKPlaybook.com on Thursday morning. Hey, but the vid will come out Wednesday afternoon. The pod will be up Wednesday morning. Boom, you got all the time in the world to go through this. Remember, the pick show coming out Wednesday night, so you can watch that all the way up until Sunday. And the ranking show came out on Tuesday for all of them. Remember, smash the like button. And for this one, after you've smashed the like button, go to the comment section, leave your DraftKings handle, and tell me, who is your favorite running back play south of $4,500 on the DraftKings Millionaire Maker main slate this weekend? Because that's what we're talking here. We're talking main slate only. No Monday night game, no Sunday night game. So when people ask after the fact, where's Rob Gronkowski? Remember, Sunday, main slate only. All right, bringing in our guest today from the Action Network. It's Chris Raybon. What's going on, dude?
What is up? We're just kind of talking about how many weddings we've had this season. So I'm glad to kind of come to you in between a couple of those weddings and talk some DK.
So I either have one of two moves here. Like the first 3 weeks on DK were kind of crappy for me. Weeks 4, weeks 5, a little bit better. I think this is going to influence the number of lineups I can play this weekend, because the Millionaire Maker's down to $10 this time around. Or like the wedding gifts that I have to give out, I'm going to have to like cut them in half.
Oh, man.
It's rough treading for me out here. Anyway, let's jump right into this. Let's talk running backs. And at the very top, Todd Gurley's there. He's $10K for the main slate. And it's a primo matchup. Not sure the status of Cooper Kupp or Brandon Cooks yet, but if those guys are out, you'd have to think there'd at least be more of an uptick in the receiving game for Todd Gurley, so the market share would go even higher. It's one of the best matchups of the week. Denver sucks against all running backs. The game script should favor him here. I know we saw what Denver did to Kansas City, but hey, what did they do? They forced Kansas City to run against them, and Kareem Hunt went nuts. Todd Gurley, I hear, better than Kareem Hunt. So $10K, is it feasible to put him in your lineup? Because the price would indicate that he's way better than everyone else on this main slate, and I would tend to agree, but can you construct lineups around him?
It's going to be tough. I went back and looked at the numbers using the Fantasy Labs NFL Trends tool, and there's only been 6 other instances when a running back has been priced $10K or higher. He's averaged 20.4 DraftKings points a game, but that's actually 7.4 points below expectation, and he's only hit expectation. They've only hit expectation 33% of the time, and they've had 30% ownership. So just based on past trends at that price, it's more of a fade just because of roster construction and the difficulty that it is for any player really to live up to that kind of salary.
Do you think that this is going to be a case where people will pay up for him? I know you just mentioned the ownership numbers, but where you have like Melvin Gordon, Christian McCaffrey, James Conner, Joe Mixon, Ezekiel Elliott, all in pretty decent spots. I know Elliott's playing the Jags. That's a bit tougher, but it's still like for what you would need to pay to get Todd Gurley. So you can have Todd Gurley, and then you can drop down to, I don't know, Carlos Hyde at $4,900, something like that. Do you think people will be willing to take that strategy, or do you think it's going to be like, hey, I can play Melvin Gordon and Joe Mixon for the same price as Gurley and some scrub? Why wouldn't I just do that?
I think there's going to be, ownership on Gurley, maybe definitely in the double digits, maybe as high as about, I'd say 17 to 20%. Gurley has gotten about, in that double-digit range in all of the kind of weeks he's been in the Millie Maker. So I think people are going to look at that 10K salary and, some people are going to say, hey, well, he's going to be tough to make a lineup around, but you have all these entries with these multi-entries, and I think people are going to be tempted, especially since he's sitting there right there at the top.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to be one of those people that will try to find a way to jam in Todd Gurley and figure out the rest of my roster around it, whether it's playing like I have a defense that I like that's super cheap. Maybe I can save some salary there. Maybe like even if I can pay down from Cameron Brate onto someone else at tight end, try to save another $1,000. It's going to have to be these little things, unless there's some sort of gigantic running back value that opens up because of injury later on in the week that I don't know. It's going to be tough to squeeze in. So of the non-Gurley guys above like 6K, you got your Gordons in there, the Elliots, like I mentioned. Do you have a favorite from that bunch?
I think if you look at it, I think Gordon is still kind of the guy here because, first of all, he doesn't drop off any when he goes on the road. Since 2017, he's averaged 22.4 DraftKings points, a 5.3 plus minus 64% consistency in road games. That's actually a lot better than he's done at home. He's also tied for third in the league in targets inside the 10-yard line. And remember, those targets convert into touchdowns at about a 38% clip, as opposed to red zone targets from the 11 to the 20, which are down at 14%. So I think Gordon is still the guy who you want in your lineups if you're not paying all the way up for Gurley.
So in terms of Melvin Gordon, we know that Austin Eckler is still playing around 30% and sometimes, give plus or minus 5% of the snaps, but he's garnering around 10 touches. They're both going to be involved in the receiving game. And when you look at Cleveland, they have a really stout run defense, but they've been very susceptible to pass catching running backs. Melvin Gordon would certainly qualify for that. But are we getting to a point where you could either play Gordon and Eckler together, or do you just roll the dice that Eckler can find the end zone at his price point and then just pay up for someone else who's not Melvin Gordon?
Yeah, if you're playing in a tournament, I think you have to play one or the other because you want that leverage if you're dropping down in the price with Eckler, and you're playing Gordon because he can kind of be that highest scoring player or back on the slate. So I don't think you necessarily want to play them together in a tournament. I think you really want that leverage there if you're saving the money with Eckler.
So at $8,300, Christian McCaffrey comes in. Do we just end up worrying that he's going to have very little touchdown equity once they get inside the 10-yard line, inside the 5-yard line, that he's going to have to score like he did against the Giants on a swing pass, beat someone and finds the end zone, that if you're going to pay up for that price, you would kind of want someone who gets goal line touches?
Yeah, obviously that's ideal. He has a few carries in the red zone this season, about 8 in the last 4 games. But I think the reason you pay up for him is he has that kind of upside like Gordon, whereas he can be the highest scoring player on the slate or at the position in any given week. But I agree, I wouldn't want to go too overweight or too highly exposed to him just because of that touchdown equity, especially since there are some other options at a bit of a cheaper price point as you go down.
Yeah, so James Conner is 77, Mixon's 75, and Ezekiel Elliott is 7,000. I think that tier of running back, if you're not going to pay all the way up for Gurley, I'm good. I mean, I don't feel good about leaving Melvin Gordon as a fade for me if I'm only constructing 10 lineups, let's say. But I think that's the concentration that you want to get. It saves you a lot of salary. Between Conner, Mixon, and Elliott, I might actually like Elliott the most. I was really encouraged to see the market share that he was able to garner out of the backfield in week 5, and hopefully that continues, especially against an attacking Jaguars defense that, hey, if he can put up 6-7 catches, we know that he's going to end up with 15 to 20 touches on the ground, all the goal line work that you hope he can find a wedge and really break through. But he has the worst matchup of these 3 guys. He'll probably be the least owned of these 3 guys. But do you think that he's equivalent in terms of upside as the other 2?
Absolutely. So when I do my main slate breakdowns over at Fantasy Labs every week, something I talk about, I kind of walk through roster construction for both cash and tournaments. And in tournaments, I always talk about kind of lowering your exposure to the players at the salary extreme, because it forces you to kind of build, naturally and organically differentiated lineups. Because if you start going with Todd Gurley and you're trying to jam him in, then there's going to be kind of a certain set of players on the other end, at the cheap end, that you're going to look at. So when you start getting in these mid-tier guys, I think you have a lot of upside and you're not paying the full price. Now, Elliott, if you look at what Jacksonville's done versus the 2 stud running backs they faced this season, Kareem Hunt and Saquon Barkley, those 2 running backs have combined to average 20.1 DraftKings points, a plus 6.1 plus minus. Both of them have hit value, and they've come at only 7.7% average ownership. So I think if you look at it from that angle, Elliott's matchup isn't as tough as we might think. And then I look back at what he's done against opponents that are in that kind of top 10 percentile, and he's actually since 2016 he's actually averaged 22.1 DraftKings points and a plus 2.2 plus minus against opponents that are in that top 10 percentile. So he's pretty much matchup proof, and Jacksonville hasn't really been prohibitive to stud running backs this season either.
So here's the problem. We're through the good running backs. Now it kind of seems like a crapshoot. TJ Yeldon is right after Jordan Howard in terms of pricing. They signed Jamal Charles. Fournette's been ruled out. There's no Corey Grant. He's done for the season. How much of an impact do you think Jamal Charles is going to make on this backfield the first week out against Dallas? Because if he's only going to play 15% of the snaps, and we saw Yeldon play over 90% last week, then Yeldon would end up becoming, I think, a pretty good play. Or is he in this price point where you can just pay up so much, you can pay up, $500 or $700 more and just get a substantially better player, that this entire $6,000 range is just going to be kind of dead.
Oh, I think you definitely don't want to overlook Yeldon. I think Yeldon might be probably dollar for dollar one of the best plays, if not the best play on the board. When you consider that, his receiving upside, and you mentioned already the snaps, so that's one thing. The fact that they're willing to play him 90% of the snaps is we don't know exactly what they're going to do this week. I don't think Jamal Charles will be that involved, just being that he's had a long layoff, but 90% snap share is a good indicator that the team is willing to play him that much. He had 11 targets last week, caught 8 passes for 89 yards and a touchdown. 2 weeks before that, 7 targets, 6 catches, 46 yards. He's actually had 45 or more yards receiving in the last 3 games. So I think that receiving upside, combined with the fact that he does have some more rushing upside now because he's really the only guy in that backfield, just kind of gives him huge overall upside. Now, the Dallas is a somewhat of a tough matchup, at least on the ground. They rank, they're a good matchup on the ground. They rank 24th in DVOA against the pass, but 5th against the run. So they're a tough matchup, but they're 22nd against the running back position, throwing the ball. So I think Yeldon's receiving upside is really what you want in this matchup.
So the other guys in that range, you got like Chris Thompson. Obviously, he's dealing with the ribs. Adrian Peterson's dealing with the shoulder. It looks like he's going to play through it. They're both going to play through it. So no love for Capri Bibbs, at least in week 6. And we're going to get there because he gets his 1 start per year. It might happen in week 13, but I'll hold out for that one. Then you got like Devonta Freeman is $6,000 in a glorious matchup against Tampa. But how much work is he going to end up getting? David Johnson takes on Minnesota, who hasn't, frankly, been all that great on defense. But that Cardinals offense is kind of terrifying. If David Johnson doesn't score 2 touchdowns, he hasn't been performing all that well outside of the touchdowns. Dalvin Cook, we don't know if he's going to play. LaShawn McCoy, Tevin Coleman could be on the good end of that split. Like, people might talk themselves into Naheem Hines here, but Marlon Mack could be back with Turbin back. I don't know if he's going to garner around the 70% snap share that he's been seeing while Mack's been out. That I find this entire area really confusing, that I might just drop down to Carlos Hyde. People are a bit scorned from last week when Duke Johnson was the one who was on the field as they were trying to play against this Ravens defense. But this matchup is a lot better against the Chargers. He could get back to his 20-plus touches, but he's sort of like Marshawn Lynch in a way, where he's going to get his 20 carries on the ground, and for DraftKings scoring, he's not going to do much through the air. He might backdoor his way into 2-3 catches, but that's probably his upside, so you need him to score touchdowns. So would that price point be worth it for either Hyde or Lynch in both their matchups?
I think that Hyde is a bit of a risky play here. If you look at his snap share, he only played 28 of the 80 snaps against the Baltimore Ravens a week ago. Now, they had 80 snaps, so it doesn't look too bad. He still got 17 carries, and he got 3 targets and 2 catches. But if they play fewer snaps and he's only in on 30-40% of them, it could be somewhat of an issue for him. I think that you actually do want to kind of look at some of these backs in that 5K tier because, like you said, it's going to confuse a lot of people. And I think that's where you're going to start to get some low ownership, and you still have some significant upside. So David Johnson, is going to worry a lot of people, but the bottom line is at 5,900 in a tournament. I think that's a really good place to kind of take a gamble on his upside. Minnesota has played really good run defense. For the most part, going back to last season, they haven't allowed a rushing touchdown in 2018, but they have allowed 18 catches for 275 yards with 2 touchdowns receiving to running backs. That is a 15.2 yards per catch. And so I think he's interesting there. And then I think Shady McCoy as well. I mean, he's kind of been, a forgotten man this year, hasn't really played that much in most of the games, even when he's made appearances, been hurt. But he had 24 carries and 3 targets last week, and he played on 47 of the 65 snaps. Now, Houston is another one of these kind of pass funnels. They're 25th in DVO against the pass, 2nd against the run, but we know McCoy can catch the ball. And if he's going to be getting, upwards of 25 touches at that price, I think he's another good kind of good risk reward play in that range with probably low ownership.
Do you have a preference between the Atlanta backfield, or is this like injection of Ito Smith near the goal line just make them all relatively unplayable?
Oof. I mean, I think that I will say I think one of them will probably have a decent game, but the fact that 3 of them are playing when you're in a tournament, you really want that running back that's going to give you, a top 2 top 3 scorer at the position on the slate. And because they're, splitting work 2 ways and potentially 3 now, which, like you said, it looks like Ito Smith is going to be involved. And that's not really a backfield that I want to kind of expose myself too much to, even against the bad defense of Tampa Bay.
Dalvin Cook, if he plays, would you play him? Or is the split between him and Murray probably not going to be all that pronounced? Plus, the Vikings have been one of the most pass-heavy teams in all of football. But if Cook sits again, would you have interest in Murray? Because he's really done nothing so far, but the price point is kind of good, and against this Cardinals team is 10-point favorites. Now you're looking at a situation where it could just lead to 20-plus touches again. Now, he hasn't done anything with them, but if we're playing volume, he's a cheap price that could backdoor his way into a ton of volume.
Yeah, I think you definitely want to not overlook the Viking backfield, especially if it looks like one of the guys is going to kind of get the majority of the workload. That would more likely be Murray if Cook is out. But the Cardinals, they've been terrible versus the running back position this year. They've given up 7 rushing touchdowns, 2 running backs, another 2 through the air in 5 games. So that's 9 touchdowns in 5 games and right under 1,000 yards, 999 yards, 2 running backs combined rushing and receiving in 5 games. That is, a hair under 200 a game. So I think you definitely want to look at this Viking backfield again. It's more of a risk reward upside play, but you want that in tournaments. You want to take chances on those 2 5K guys that can equal the production of guys in that 8, 9, 10K range, because you're going to have such an advantage on the field if you're doing that in such unique roster construction where you're going to be able to pay up a lot more at wide receiver, tight end, or even quarterback than a lot of the other entrants.
So sub $5,000 at running back, the ones that kind of pop off the screen to me, this is assuming Lamar Miller plays, so then it would make Alfred Blue sort of like a definitely get him in there. If Lamar Miller sits, Alfred Blue becomes the uber chalk of week 6. But just with all things being equal, Dion Lewis at $4,700 seems like a play against a good defense where Derrick Henry just hasn't done anything. Dion Lewis has looked like the substantially better back. I just worry about his touchdown equity at $4,700, that he may have to do that himself, and it might really cap his upside. The other ones, Bilal Powell at $4,500 against Indy, in what could be a very high-paced game, since Indy runs so many plays per second that the Jets may have to keep up with them in that regard. And since this is less than a field goal game, I could see them reverting to Bilal Powell a little bit, unless Crowell starts breaking off 80-yard runs again, which probably isn't sustainable week after week after week. It'll just happen for him like once every 5 weeks, like we've seen. So Powell, especially with his pass catching prowess, should be all right. And then Eckler is the other one. Like, you could talk yourself into Chris Carson. He's $4,400, but that split worries me, especially if Mike Davis is going to be the goal line back. That Eckler just seems safe, and he has upside in this matchup.
Yeah, see, this is the tier where I think it's easy. It's a little easier to talk yourself into some of these guys, but this is why I kind of prefer that the tier kind of above it, even though those guys haven't been performing as well, just because you're kind of getting a little bit more of an upside in terms of workload and a little more certainty. A lot of these guys in this range are committee backs. So, Eckler is a guy who I think, especially when you play the slates, I forget if he's on the early or the afternoon slate, but whatever slate that is, he's usually a go-to in those slates. On the bigger slates, he's been scoring kind of so much that I think at this point, he's kind of, you might want to lay off of him a little bit. I think people might catch on a little more. And then Powell is a guy who, listen, he had 20 carries. The Colts have been a little bit better on defense. Powell playing just over half the snaps. So I think the issue with him is that he didn't get a target in the last game, so we can't really depend on what the pass catching upside is going to be. Alex Collins, another guy losing some work to Buck Allen, Tariq Cohen, matchup specific. So this is kind of a landmine tier. I think Philip Lindsay is an interesting one in this tier, just because he's been kind of so good that he's kind of maybe similar to your Eckler in that he can get you he's going to get you double digit touches and has just been kind of outperforming what he's really supposed to do. So Lindsay actually probably is one of my favorite plays here. And I think, Carson is a guy who, the touches are there, but like you said, the goal line work at any time could kind of disappear. And Mike Davis has made a case to kind of get more work himself. So I think this is actually the tier with the landmine tier, which is why you kind of want to see if you can find some guys about, 5K or higher.
So I guess the last one we need to talk about is just the Tampa Bay backfield. With Ronald Jones getting some run at the end of that Chicago blowout before the bye week, it seemed like he's active for the first time all year. They're now using him. Peyton Barber was getting a huge percentage of the snap share, and it looks like that could be converted over to Ronald Jones. So you have Ronald Jones at $3,900. You have Peyton Barber at $3,500. And then you have Jaquiz Rogers even lower than that. If you think this is a pass-happy game, I suppose you can make a case for Kiz, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to play him. But Ronald Jones is the one that intrigues me. I have no idea if he's going to be used, if he's going to be any good, because he certainly hasn't looked good so far, but this is too good of a matchup to pass up on. Do you have any sort of lean for this backfield?
It's really tough because you do want to play running backs against Atlanta because of the fact that they just give up so much production through the air. Now, the issue with playing Jones is that he's kind of been known as a guy who we weren't quite sure what, how good he is as a receiver or in pass protection. So I think Jaquiz Rogers may potentially be kind of the guy that gets that work in this matchup. And then the other thing with Tampa Bay is when you're playing their running backs, I mean, it's not about the matchup anymore. It just becomes about their own offensive line. I mean, they're last in adjusted line yards. They're the only team with under 3.0 adjusted line yards per rush this season per Football Outsiders. And I mean, it's kind of another, it's an ugly situation that in a tournament, even though I am looking for these kind of differentiation plays, we see this every week. I mean, last week, I think that the running backs in the winning Millie Maker lineup were Yeldon, DJ, and was it Connor? I think it was Connor, or, one of those chalk plays, and they were all kind of highly owned. So at running back, I think you kind of leverage that predictability a little bit more, and you try to get guys that you're sure are going to get those 20 carries or 20 touches, I should say, and let the chips fall where they may. And there's so many more options at wide receiver that even though there are some kind of enticing matchups at cheap price points at running back, it's not necessarily a situation that I like to touch at that position just because it's so easy to predict some of the higher workload guys.
Do you have any feel for the Seattle-Oakland game?
I think that's going to be, the one thing about these running backs in the Seattle-Oakland game is that Russell Wilson really has been running a lot less. And that's kind of helped out the Seahawks backfield because they're getting more touches. Also, obviously, because Brian Schottenheimer's there, they want to run the ball more. So I think that Seattle will continue to try to run the football. But I think, we have a squeaky wheel situation here with Doug Baldwin, which I think is interesting. And I think, being what Baldwin has meant to that franchise, and what he's meant to Russell Wilson, I would think that squeaky wheel gets greased this week.
All right, well, let's switch to receivers. And before we get to Baldwin, let's talk about the top-end guys. Brown is going to come in at the very highest of all prices. Then it's Adam Thielen, then it's Mike Evans, and A.J. Green. Those are your four guys above $8,000. And it seems... Brown outscored Juju last week, but you're still getting a significant discount to take on Juju Smith-Schuster instead of rostering Antonio Brown. And, if we're talking about these high-end running backs, does it make sense to try to squeeze in a high-end receiver, or would you just allocate that salary cap towards the high-end running backs and just pay down at receiver?
So I think that I always like kind of going against the grain a little bit in these tournaments, but I like doing it a little more in a balanced way. So, people are going to pay up a lot more at running back, I think. And, that would lead me not necessarily to go, all the way up to Antonio Brown, but I would try to kind of skew a little more expensive in wide receiver. And again, kind of look at those running backs in that 5K, that 6K tier. And so I think Brown is still a little too high priced. I mean, I think he was kind of due for regression. I know that's the gambler's fallacy, but he was averaging like under 10 yards a catch and whatnot. So you knew he was going to have a better game sooner or later. But on the road, generally you want to play Antonio Brown at home for that maximum upside that kind of goes along with his price point. So I'd actually be looking a tiny bit below that tier to two guys that are, I think, just grossly underpriced. And that's Julio Jones and DeAndre Hopkins. They're both under 8K. And, in situations like this, if you look at just since the start of last season, I used the Fantasy Labs Trends tool to kind of pull up, how these guys perform when they're under 8K on DraftKings. And Julio Jones, 25.6 DraftKings points. and a plus 8.1 plus minus, and he's hit value in 71% of his games, in the 7 games that he's been under 8K since the start of last year. And then Hopkins, he's had 11 such games, 21.7 DraftKings points, a plus 6.6 plus minus, 91% consistency rating, and 11% ownership, which is decent. So I know you got, Tre'Davious White to worry about. Buffalo's 7th in DVOA versus number 1 wideouts, but these two guys in a tournament have just as much upside as the 4 you just mentioned above them, and they're coming at a nice discount.
Well, is there a chance that Adam Thielen becomes the lost guy at $8,500 just because that price is so jarring next to his name? But no fewer than 10 targets in any single game this year, over 100 yards. He scored in 3 of the 5. And logic would kind of dictate that you can move him to the slot a little bit and then stick Patrick Peterson on Stefan Diggs, and then it could be an even bigger market share for Adam Thielen in this matchup. I do worry that the Cardinals' defensive line can really break through and rattle Kirk Cousins over and over. But even in that Bills game, which is probably worst case scenario, Thielen was still good.
Yeah, I think Thielen is a guy who, at this point, he's kind of cash viable in a tournament. Again, it's just really, you're trying to kind of get that Thielen production at a little bit of a cheaper price point. So yeah, I think you lock him in at 8,500. You're probably going to get, he's been over 100 yards in every game this season. He's been 6 or more catches in every game this season. So I think you're going to get kind of a really high floor, but there's a decent chance, just because there's so many receivers on this slate and every other main slate, that there's going to be at least a couple of wide receivers that you can get a little bit cheaper that are going to be able to kind of approximate his production, and unless he goes completely bonkers, again, which is possible, which is why you want to have exposure. But generally, again, that's why I like to pay down a little bit more, just to kind of get, you want to get like 3 production wise, you want to get 3 Adam Thielens in your lineup, and it's harder to do when you're paying $8,500 for him.
When we're talking about game stacks, Atlanta and Tampa Bay is going to be a big one. Pittsburgh and Cincinnati is going to be a big one. But that Falcons-Bucks matchup, you have Mike Evans priced up pretty highly, above $8,000. D-Jax comes in around that mid-tier. Chris Godwin is pretty cheap. And then you have Cameron Brate at $3,700. How do you think the distribution shakes out for those 4 guys? Do you think that people will pass on Mike Evans because you can get the cheaper options in that offense and really build the rest of your team near the top? Or will people just say, hey, this game total is somewhat approaching 60 at this point, you might as well just put in the best player?
Well, I think you got to look at anytime you're kind of wondering about how the receiver ownership will shake out, you got to look at the quarterbacks, and Jameis Winston there at 5,800 in this matchup, I think is going to have a ton of ownership. I think he's going to be pretty chalky. So anytime you have a quarterback like that that's chalky, I think his number 1 receiver will be chalky. Now, I know there will be a lot of Winston, Cameron Brate stacks, which may help to lower Evans' ownership a little, but I also think that people will just go Winston, Brate, Evans. And so I think Evans will be highly owned. I think, on the other side, you mentioned Julio will be higher owned. I think, Godwin and D-Jax are nice kind of, and Calvin Ridley. Those are kind of the guys, if you're not going to pay up for Evans and Jones and you don't want the chalk, the super chalk in Brate, you kind of look to some of those other receivers in that game. Godwin, red zone, D-Jax, one can do it in one play. Just the air yards are there for him. And then Calvin really has just been a monster, had kind of one quiet game that maybe lowers his ownership a little bit. And even Mohamed Sanu, on the Falcons, you have to kind of consider all of the guys who are going to see targets in a matchup like this where the over-under is, hovering around 57, 58 points.
Well, almost to speak to that point where Calvin Ridley has a bit of a down week that might get a few people off of him, I was kind of thinking the same thing about Tyler Boyd. He had the down week. This is a matchup against the Steelers where you can have the Steelers in the air kind of all you want. And if Joe Hayden is back, he can try to lock down A.J. Green to the best of his, capabilities. Then you have Tyler Boyd kind of running freely. No John Ross. I'm not sure how much CJ Uzomah is really going to be a factor in the passing game. So you have Mixon catching balls out of the backfield. It could be like a 13, 14 target day for Tyler Boyd if this over-under even comes close to approaching that over. So I think he's the guy among those 2 big game stacks that's going to come in. He's the cheapest member of like the elite options in terms of the Steelers-Bengals game. And it feels like no one wants him.
Yeah, and Pittsburgh, the matchup kind of sets up well for him. Pittsburgh is, they're number 2 in DVOA versus passes to running backs. They're actually above average, to number 1 wide receivers as well, but they are 21st, to the middle of the field. I think Boyd will see a little more action over the middle, especially with Eifert out. So I think, Boyd is kind of a very good kind of overlooked play, just like you said. I mean, he could lead the Bengals in receiving. He's liable to lead the Bengals in receiving pretty much every week now. If AJ Green's not it, Boyd is looking like the guy.
So the other thing, too, is the Rams. The Rams are going to consistently score 30 points a week regardless. And, if that's Gurley this week, then it's all Gurley. But Kupp and Cooks both dealing with concussion issues. They have to pass protocol in order to play. Let's run through some scenarios here for the Rams. Let's say they both play. Do you have a preference of any of the three Rams receivers, or are they all just kind of fades in this matchup?
I think if they play, I prefer, I don't think I prefer any of them as much as I want exposure to them, because I think people won't be really planning to play them as it stands now, because we still kind of don't know exactly what is going on with their availability. I think Cooks is probably maybe a slight preference, just because the air yards will be there for him, and he's the most expensive, so maybe that kind of deters ownership off of him a little bit. Whereas I think Woods will be a little more highly owned either way, because he's the guy that's healthy.
If both of them are out, let's say one of them are out or both of them are, Kupp and Cooks, does that make Josh Reynolds at $3,900 just someone you plug and play just for all the savings?
Absolutely. If you look at, he's played 70% of the snaps 3 times, in his career, and in those 3 games, he's gotten 7 red zone targets. So this is a guy with the 86th percentile catch radius, according to Player Profiler. And he's a young guy who, we know Sean McVay knows how to get his receivers in good spots, get them open, get them production. And so I think anytime you're looking at a situation where Reynolds, he elevates to essentially a top 3 target in this offense, if both of them are out, right behind Woods and Todd Gurley. So I think you're getting a lot of upside at that price point.
All right. Was there anyone else in the $6,000 range that you noticed that really stuck out as a good value? Because I would say T.Y. Hilton, but I have no idea what his health status is.
Yeah. I think that if you look at it, probably Jarvis Landry, kind of week in, week out, I think, anytime his price is kind of hovering around that mid 600s, this is a guy that can just be an absolute target hog, even in a matchup against LA, who's, we kind of fear them a little bit, but they haven't been quite as good in terms of, defending pretty much anyone this year. And Landry has double-digit targets in all but one of his games this season. He's caught 5 balls, and I believe it's 21 of 22 games dating back to when he was with the Dolphins last season. So for DraftKings, he has that huge upside. You have a much more competent quarterback here in Baker Mayfield than you had in what Tyrod Taylor showed early in the year. And you have a situation where this Charger team is still a small favorite, and Cleveland could be playing from behind, and you could just end up seeing the catches and yards pile up for Landry.
Well, we could talk about that in terms of Landry, but if Rashard Higgins misses this game with a knee problem, you then have Callaway at a decent price, and you have Njoku at a decent price as well. Would it be worth it just to take a shot on one of those 2 guys and hope the targets funnel towards them? I know it's tough with Njoku because Darwin's been so good, but even Callaway, if he's just out there, and there's a couple guys like this, like John Brown is one of them, saw 14 targets last week, didn't do anything with them, but they just seem like potential cheaper versions of Jarvis Landry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those guys are all in play in tournaments. But, the reason I like Landry is kind of that exact reason, that people are going to kind of be paying attention to other Browns receivers. But at the end of the day, there's no one more likely to put up, a 30-point game than Jarvis Landry. And he comes at a price where, again, 6,600, you can fit a bunch of other guys like that into your lineup, because that's what you're really trying to do. You don't need in tournaments, I think, some people kind of they feel like they need these dart throws or these very kind of off the wall plays or these very cheap plays to hit or anything. Realistically, if you could just kind of assemble a balanced roster of a bunch of kind of middle tier guys, all with top tier upside, you're in good shape. So that's kind of why I like the Landrys of the world, because they do get a little overlooked, because people look and say, hey, I'll go with Njoku or I'll just pay down for Callaway. But just the target upside here for a guy like Landry and a bunch of other guys in that range is a lot higher than guys that are going to be $2,000 cheaper.
Yeah. So you have Will Fuller and T.Y. Hilton, both the hamstring problems in that $6,000 range. I mentioned I like T.Y. Hilton if he plays and if he's 100%, but I think that's probably unknowable, even if he is active. I guess if he gets in full practices on Thursday and Friday, maybe he's going to be fine. And Will Fuller, he was healthy last week, didn't look so healthy when he was on the field. He was almost out there for pure decoy reasons. Don't get hurt, Will. It'll be fine. But you brought up the Tre'Davious White situation with DeAndre Hopkins. That has depressed his price a little bit. I think people are going to be really iffy on Will Fuller because of that injury, because of what he did last week. And we even talked about how Dallas is one of these teams that's going to funnel passes instead of runs. Fuller didn't capitalize at all on that. But if he's back to being healthy, I feel like he is the pivot in this entire range that no one's going to go to, that if he can get back to even 90% health, that he is in primo position to take advantage of this Buffalo defense. Because everyone wants to play Kiki. Kiki's the new guy. And apparently Will Fuller, now that he hasn't caught a touchdown in every single game that he's played with Deshaun Watson, that he's no longer a good play. Like, it's expensive, but people were locking him into cash games as of 2 weeks ago because of the market share that he was seeing and the upside that he possessed. That I think it's worth rolling the dice on, even if it's only like 10%, because he's not even sniffing 10% in terms of ownership this week. He's going to be like 2%.
Yeah, I think I think Fuller's a guy, and you can stack him with Deshaun Watson, because I think that's probably the highest leverage way to go about that situation. If Fuller's hits, he's probably going to either have caught a couple of touchdowns or he's going to catch at least one deep touchdown. So I like the Fuller stack with Watson as a pivot off the Watson Hopkins stacks, or stack all three of them, because we've seen these guys kind of go off in the same game, and Watson has been putting up huge yardage numbers pretty much throughout, his career at this point. So I like the Fuller call as well.
In the 5K range, I like John Brown the best, even in a tougher matchup against the Titans. But tell me about Doug Baldwin, because Doug Baldwin has broken my heart this season.
Yeah. So again, mentioned it. This is not, the most data-driven analysis here, but we've seen this in the past. When you have a well-respected veteran wide receiver who's talented on a functional football team with a functional quarterback, and he kind of squeaks, that greasy wheel usually kind of gets, that squeaky wheel usually gets greased. He had one target last week, one catch for 1 yard. He's not going, knowing Doug Baldwin, he's not going to be happy sitting here with that stat line being the last stat line that he has put up. I think that this is a game, against the Oakland Raiders. This is not a prohibitive defense by any means in terms of stopping the pass. And I think that, Seattle has had some success in recent weeks, kind of using the run game, something that we haven't seen out of them. I think in this game, they kind of say, okay, hey, we can use Baldwin at least as an extension of the run game to, kind of a chain mover. In this one, Oakland is 30th in DVOA against the pass on defense this year. So good matchup for Baldwin to get right.
So, I mean, there's the case for Baldwin, and I feel like a lot of people are going to be taking a stance one way or another on him, that this is the rebound week for Doug Baldwin, or they're going to be in the other camp like, Doug Baldwin's washed, like he's still hurt, he can't play. Although there's no real evidence to indicate that he's still hurt because he's playing all the snaps. It's not like all of a sudden you look at his snap rate and it's like 1/4 of what it used to be. If he's hurt, I don't understand why he would be out there like run blocking the entire time. But Lockett's right there as well. Like, do you think anyone will go back to Lockett, or do you think it's just if anyone's going to play a piece of this now somewhat run-heavy Seattle offense, that it's going to be Baldwin over Lockett, and Lockett just gets overlooked?
Yeah, I think that will definitely be the case, but I think either one of in a tournament, either one of them is an option, because you also can stack them with Russell Wilson, and I think both of those guys. When I'm stacking, actually, I like to go with the guys who catch deeper passes. So I think when I'm stacking, I probably go Lockett over Baldwin, but I like Baldwin just as kind of a play that you kind of throw in there to kind of fill out your lineup. Not really correlated to anything, but just a guy who, he's had a 1 catch, 1 yard game, but he can also have a 10 catch, 100-yard game.
Is there anyone in this $4,000 area you're going to? Like, are you going to Kiki?
Oh, yeah, I think, Kiki, you have to start looking at Kiki. But one guy I did want to talk about before we, got out of this range was in that same game, and that is Amari Cooper. When you look at Cooper, he's a guy that is just maddeningly inconsistent. And, people that because of that, people do not really they don't know what to do with him. So they don't really touch him. But, I have this trend. I had set up a trend, so I get an alert every time he has a game like this, on Fantasy Labs. But if you look at him when he's scored, 5 or fewer DraftKings points the game before in his career, the next game, he comes out with he averages, it's been 12 instances. He averages 16.2 points, a plus 2.5 plus minus, 58% consistency at only 8.2% ownership. So I think this is another time where you kind of want, if you're looking for some low ownership but high upside, you go back to Amari here and you can correlate him with Baldwin or Lockett as well.
That's really interesting. Cooper is, if Pete is off camera right now holding a gun to your head, just nod once or twice. And if this is like the pro Fantasy Labs Amari Cooper love, and then I can dig into this just a little bit more. But he's like, he's becoming like the homeless person's version of Tyreek Hill, where just play Tyreek Hill in GPPs every week because he's going to score 40 points like 5 times a year. With Amari Cooper, that's down to like 1. But it's going to happen at some point. So do you just roll him out there almost every week if his price is low?
Well, no, you roll him out coming off a bad game. That's because that's how you kind of mitigate, the losses. It's like, when he comes off a bad game, the ownership goes down and the price goes down, and he tends to more often than not follow that up with a big game. And so I think that's kind of how you approach Amari. But yeah, it's really maddening at this point.
So for the $4,000 range, I think you're looking at Kiki, you're looking at Godwin, just based on the team totals of both Houston and Tampa Bay this week. Antonio Callaway, if Higgins is out, that's just going to be, if he can catch the ball most of the time, that would be nice. But it's a decent matchup in what could be a very high-scoring game. The one I worry about, and I think a lot of people might go to, is going to be Taylor Gabriel. I just feel like Miami slows down the game so much, it kind of detrimentally impacts everyone on the field. Like, they just don't run any plays.
Yeah, Taylor Gabriel, I think the Tampa Bay matchup was really kind of a perfect matchup for him. This is probably another situation where, when you have a player like Taylor Gabriel, who's not, an elite, Julio Jones or one of those guys, and you see them kind of coming off a ridiculously big game, usually those kind of guys don't put up back-to-back huge games. Now it does happen, but just tends to not happen. So Gabriel is a guy who, I think that, and for the reason you mentioned, Miami is not necessarily a team that you're going to get into one of these situations where you're going to have to throw a ton of passes. Now their defense has kind of slipped a little bit in recent weeks, so you could get things going when you think about the fact that Xavier Howard may be locking up on Allen Robinson. So I think that's kind of a reason to play Gabriel, But yeah, it's kind of tough. He's going to be a tough guy to predict, and I generally fade guys coming off the huge games.
Well, we talked about Houston as sort of a pass funnel defense. Dallas the same way. There's 3 Jags receivers that are all kind of playable, but all not playable at the same time because you're never going to know who it is in any. It's sort of like the really terrible version of the Rams offense where, hey, there's 3 guys, but you can play any 3 of the Rams receivers and they're generally pretty good. With the Jags, you have like a 1 in 4 chance that they have a good week, essentially. Do you look at the cheapest option and roll Moncrief out there?
Well, the interesting thing is Moncrief is not only the cheapest option, but he's actually the best option. If you look at the numbers, he's leading the team in air yard share at 34%, in target share at 18%, in red zone targets at 5%, and in targets inside the 10-yard line at 4%. So from, just from the numbers, we know wide receiver, tough position to predict, but Moncrief has actually been that guy. And we kind of, they alluded to this when they signed him to, they gave him the $9 million for the year on the Prove It deal. He was running as a starter, as a top 2 receiver for Jacksonville all summer. And we've kind of seen that kind of come to fruition with his usage over these last few weeks. So I think Moncrief is a top play, the safest play at this point on the Jaguars. But, Keelan Cole sitting there at 4,800. We know the kind of upside he has. He's second on the team in air yards share, but at only 21%. But we know it only takes a game for that to kind of, stabilize a little bit between him and Moncrief. So I think, like you said, all of them are kind of in play Moncrief is the safest, probably the highest upside just from the numbers, but I think Cole was right there behind him as well.
Yeah, and then in the like sub $4,000 range, Josh Reynolds becomes sort of the auto lock play if Kupp or Cooks ends up missing this week, because you know that he's going to be on the field, and that's basically good enough whenever you're playing on the Rams. Then you kind of look down, and the rest of there's no Valdez Scantling that jumps out this week as, hey, that guy's $3,300, perfect. I'll plug him in and build the rest of my team however I want. Like, is there anyone you see from this 3K range that's someone you have to play, or are they all just dart throws like you were mentioning earlier?
Yeah, I think they're more or less dart throws. I think that the guys in this range, if there's kind of a must play, they're going to stick out. I think a couple of interesting ones. Martavis Bryant, he's kind of been, he got cut, then he resigned, and all of a sudden he's sitting here and he tends to, he doesn't play many snaps, but he put up 51 yards 2 weeks ago, 91 yards last week. He's getting a ton of air yards here when he's out there. So I think, he might work his way into more snaps eventually. That could potentially be a good situation to roll the dice on. Besides that, it's tough. I think, who do we got here? Cortland Sutton is still a guy who he's just struggling. He's getting some usage, but he's kind of struggling. So I don't know if you really want to roll the dice at him. Taywan Taylor, we thought was in a really good spot a couple weeks ago, and then he really disappointed with the usage last week. But if the Titans get in a situation where they play the Buffalo Bills last week in a very low scoring game. Now the Ravens kind of sets up in the same way, but if the Ravens kind of jump out ahead or something like that, and the Tennessee Titans are forced to throw the ball a little bit. We saw Marcus Mariota go for a ton of yards against Philadelphia, and in that game we saw Taywan Taylor go 7 catches, 77 yards. So I think he's a guy who with some sneaky kind of volume-driven upside as well. And then David Moore, super just a dart throw on the Seahawks, but he's a guy who really flashed in the preseason, just kind of a few monster catches. I really liked him. Actually recommended him for the late slate this past week, and he ended up coming through with 2 touchdowns. So I think he's going to work his way into more playing time, played just over 50% of the snaps for the Seahawks. And, they're phasing Brandon Marshall out. So I think David Moore really sneaky now that they don't really have their tight end, Will Dissly. And we'll see what happens with Baldwin. But if Baldwin's not the guy, and Lockett, they need like a second guy for Lockett. I wouldn't be surprised if Moore kind of was like the second most targeted guy in this game.
Well, the one guy down here, you mentioned Taywan Taylor. Tajaé Sharpe played 61% of the snaps last week for Tennessee. That was well more than Taywan Taylor, which kind of blew my mind because I don't understand why that's a thing, but it is. And if this is a game where Baltimore's playing a pretty solid pace, they're running a lot of plays, they're throwing a lot, that if you're going to get a guy who's on the field like 65% of the time, I know it's a bad matchup, but he's only $3,200. And it seems like no one covers him on the other team because he's Tajaé Sharpe and he's just more prone to drop the ball than anything else. But they've been looking at him in the red zone. He might actually be a better play than Taylor. I know Taylor has that like game-breaking upside, but if you're just looking just for someone who could potentially post like 5 for 55 and catch a touchdown, $3,200 isn't a terrible gamble.
Yeah, I probably stick to him maybe like on the early slate. I think you kind of said it. Taylor has the game breaking upside. I think the fact that Taylor's only 700 more more than Sharpe. I think you still want to lean Taylor here. Sharpe, he caught the touchdown. He's been on the field more snaps, but he's still yet to clear. He's yet to clear 30 receiving yards. That's the kind of his high for this year, and that's kind of been the story with him. In his career, on the field, but not very productive. So I'd still personally lean Taylor, but I see where you're coming from with Sharpe. I think like on a more limited slate, I think he could end up being that guy that gets you to the lineup construction that you need.
Let's switch to quarterbacks. You hit it earlier that Jameis is going to end up being super chalky in this high game total. He's great savings. Should you play him in the Millionaire Maker?
Oh yeah. Listen, I don't think quarterback is a position necessarily that you want to fade just because of ownership in the Millie Maker, especially when you're getting them at that price point. I could see if it was, somebody like Tom Brady and he's like 8K or something, and just ridiculously overpriced compared to the rest of the quarterbacks. But I think the way you play it with the passing game in tournaments like this is you really want to kind of differentiate at the pass catching positions, because that's where there's so many options. So, the way the Falcons defense has been playing, Jameis Winston could be the highest scoring quarterback on the slate. That's definitely within the realm of possibility. So I don't think you want to be kind of necessarily, left out in the dark or too underexposed to Jameis in this game. I think, again, you just want to maybe differentiate you go with Godwin, like you mentioned earlier, or a Deshaun Jackson, who we know is going to get the air yards, even though they haven't had as much chemistry as Djax and Fitzpatrick. And you differentiate that way, but I wouldn't fade him.
All right, so who else are we looking at below $6,000 as the cheap option? Do you even differentiate off Jameis, or you just say, hey, if I'm paying down, I'm using Jameis, that's the way to go? Or are you going to be someone who rolls out Russell Wilson into a lineup, Marcus Mariota into a lineup, Joe Flacco potentially, who's throwing the ball a ton? I don't love it. I like Baker Mayfield. He'd probably be my second choice of all these guys in a game that they could be behind. They could be throwing a ton. He can do a bit with his legs as well. That in the Chargers defense, like you mentioned, not great so far this season. That I think those would be the two guys from that range that I like the best.
Yeah, I think those guys, I like those guys. I think a couple other ones that I'm looking at are on the other side, Phillip Rivers against Cleveland. I know Cleveland's defense has been, really, they're up to number 2 in DVOA on defense, but we know Phillip Rivers is a guy who, matchups are not really going to affect him. He gets the ball out really quick. He's got a ton of playmakers all around the field. And I think that this is a week where, a lot of the attention's on Melvin Gordon because, Gurley is so expensive, and, Gordon just kind of that guy that you feel like you can depend on. But let's not forget, Gordon's catching a ton of passes. So I think, stacking a Rivers-Gordon stack, or just using Rivers with a guy like Keenan Allen, who may be overlooked this week because there are some, other higher total games, would be a really good play in this one. And then also Derek Carr, he's another one, not sexy, but there's a huge correlation between opposing quarterbacks. It's actually stronger than ever this season. So if you look at the Fantasy Labs correlations to quarterbacks, their fantasy points are correlated at a correlation coefficient of 0.59, and then the plus minuses for quarterbacks at 0.37. So if we look at that, the other side of that game, Oakland's defense not very good, bottom 3 in DVOA against the pass. We kind of like Russell Wilson's spot, Tyler Lockett, Baldwin, Moore, all those guys, the running backs. If Seattle's able to put up some points, then I think you're going to see Carr throwing the ball all around the yard, because that's what he's been doing this season. He has, 268 or more yards in every game, 3 games of 300 or more, 2 games of 340 or more. So I think Carr's kind of a sneaky option. You can stack him with a guy like Amari Cooper, who will also be low owned, and get some nice differentiation there.
All right, so if you're going to pay up, the guys in the big games, you mentioned Jameis, that's where everyone's going low, but between Ryan, Dalton, and Ben, do you have a preference, or would you rather just pivot and just play someone like Deshaun Watson or Cam? I'm always on Team Cam. I play Cam every single week because I always feel like he is a slate breaker, that if he has his good game, it's better than everyone else's big games. But Deshaun Watson's getting into that mix too, for the amount of times that they throw, the fact that he's rushing for so much yardage every single game, at least 35 rushing yards every single game. And I wasn't too thrilled to watch him try to run like jet sweeps near the goal line against Dallas and watch him get rocked on every single play, but I like that he's calling his own number near the goal line.
Yeah, I think Watson is an autos play every week because, especially when you look at our projected ownership right now, we have Winston as the highest owned quarterback, Matt Ryan number 2. So we have Winston at 17 to 20%, Ryan at 13 to 16%. Then Kirk Cousins we have up there as well. But Deshaun Watson's clocking in at 5 to 8%. So anytime, Watson for me, I do my rankings over there at Action Network, and Watson every week for me is a top 2, 3, 4 quarterback. And when he's not being owned like it, and he's, I think you have to get him in your lineups because, besides the fact that he's running, he's putting up yardage, you kind of hit on it. The receivers that he has just give him upside in itself. Like even if he didn't have this crazy rushing upside or whatnot. So I think you definitely want to look at Watson as that guy you kind of, smash into your lineups. And you mentioned it. Newton's another one. I like Newton as well. Anytime you get him at 6,100, a really great price point for a guy that can score, multiple rushing touchdowns in a given game. And, he's had a couple of games already, the 2 games before last week, 29 or more DraftKings points. So I think those 2 guys for that rushing upside would be my 2 favorite plays. And then another guy that I think will go overlooked, especially if one or more of the wideouts is out, is Jared Goff. But Jared Goff is another one who he's been putting up just monster numbers. He has 320 or more passing yards in each of his last 4 games, 10 touchdowns in his last 4 games. And so I think, you can get him at probably sub 5% ownership, especially if he's only missing, let's say, one of his receivers. I think he still has tremendous upside. You can stack him with a guy like Reynolds and get some differentiation. You also get leverage off Gurley when you play Goff, because let's say that, the Rams score all their touchdowns come passing and, Gurley doesn't catch one. He just gets a ton of yards. You're looking at, Goff kind of getting those touchdowns that Gurley was supposed to get. And you have some nice leverage at, $4,000 cheaper. So I really like Goff as kind of a contrarian play.
See, I can be talking to that for sure. Maybe I'll I'll probably only play 9 to 12 lineups this week. Then I'm trying to really kind of make a stand that I really want to go overweight on 3 quarterbacks. Probably play them all 33% of lineups. That I'm thinking, I'm probably going to need to play Jameis at some spot. But if I just rolled out lineups that had Cam, Watson, and Goff and hope that they're the slate breakers, I just have a ton, like you mentioned, a ton of leverage on the field because these guys just aren't being owned the way that they should be. For their upside, they're not being owned the way that they should be owned. But let's switch to tight end because it's Cameron Brate week, right? What's he going to be, like 90% owned?
Man, I think he's definitely going to be up there. So the thing about Brate, and again, I talked about this earlier, in tournaments, pass catchers are generally the place that you want to pivot from these high-owned options. So I think Brate is a great fade candidate, whether you're talking about Jameis Winston lineups or not, because it's not like Brate is going to go deep a lot. So if he catches touchdowns from Jameis, yes, the stack will probably pay off, but he's not necessarily going to be responsible for a lot of Jameis's yardage. That will still be somebody else. So I think you can fade Brate pretty confidently either way and kind of maybe get your exposure to him in cash games. The interesting thing about it with Brate is that, we think about him with OJ Howard out, but in 3 games with Howard out in 2017, only 4 targets and 2.3 catches for 20 yards a game with no touchdowns. The real key here is that Jameis is back, in 14 games with Winston since the start of last season. He had Brate averages of 5.2 targets compared to only 2.8 in the 5 games without Jameis. So I think, some good, kind of a solid cash play, but definitely a guy that you want to look to pivot away from in tournaments at that kind of ownership. And he's not really super reliable.
So if you're not going to use, let's say you fade Cameron Brate in tournaments, I think that does make sense. If he's going to be uber chalk, that Cameron Brate, not the most reliable guy on the board. And even if he does score a touchdown, that doesn't mean he's going to be the highest scoring tight end on the slate either. So would you pay up or pay down from there? Because I think in this week where we talked about it, that you're going to want to pay up for running backs to some extent, whether it's 2 of them, whether it's 3 of them, to get that reliability, and you can pay the mid-tier for the wide receivers. You need to save money elsewhere, that even if Doyle sits, that it's hard to get up to Ebron at $5,400. He'd be the preferred play on the slate, but everyone else is sort of touchdown or bust. That I don't know if I would want to take any of them. And I start looking down, it's like, well, the options aren't all that great, but everyone kind of put their faith in Vance McDonald last week. Did not work out. These are usually good spots to go to the chalk bust from last week in a super high total game. Like, everyone's going to want pieces of the Steelers-Bengals game, but people will talk themselves into like CJ Uzomah overusing Vance McDonald here. I don't know if either of them are truly great plays, but I know that McDonald does have upside.
Yeah, I think, McDonald has upside. You can kind of get him as a post-hype kind of guy. I think he'll still get some, significant, like maybe like, in that 7 to 10% ownership range. I don't think he'll be completely contrarian, but I think, Uzomah is a guy who he has the matchup in his favor. I mean, Pittsburgh has not been good against the tight end position. I think he's cheap enough that you can kind of take a chance on him. Pittsburgh 25th in DVOA against tight ends. But there are also a couple of guys who I mentioned, if you kind of stick to the strategy of not going to the extremes with any of your plays. So if you're not just smashing in a Gurley or an Antonio Brown or somebody like that, you're going to have room to kind of have some flexibility here. And I think there are actually a couple of interesting guys that you can pay up for. One is Jordan Reed, coming off just a game where he had only one catch. We currently have him projected for 0 to 1% ownership now. Maybe that'll rise a little bit throughout the week as people talk about him a little bit more. But Carolina is actually, we think of them as this really good team defending the tight end. They have Luke Kuechly. For so many years they had Thomas Davis. They have all the athletic linebackers, but they're actually 27th in DVOA against the tight end position this season. Jordan Reed sitting there at 5,200, gonna be low owned, and we know what kind of touchdown upside he has. And if this is a game where maybe you have Cam Newton on the other side, you bring it back with a guy like Jordan Reed, or even a Christian McCaffrey, one of those two, you bring it back with a Jordan Reed. You have a game like last week where Carolina played a 33-31 game. I was on Barkley and Odell. I talked about those two guys as guys you wanted to get in your lineups because they had kind of all of this upside and they were being low owned. I think Reed at the tight end position is a similar in a similar vein to them. And then Jared Cook and Trey Burton as well. Cook still getting a ton of air yards, over 20% of the Raiders' air yards. And Trey Burton going against Miami, a team that always struggles against at that linebacker position. They struggle to cover backs and tight ends a little bit. So I think, if you can kind of pay up to be contrarian, they're still relatively cheap. I mean, in the 4 or 5K range. And you could get some differentiation that way as well.
If you did want to pay down and absolutely punt at tight end for all those savings, is there a preferred target from down there? Because I'm looking with Austin Seferian-Jenkins out. You could pay down in that matchup on either side. I think you could use Jeff Swaim, who's just been getting more and more usage every single week. But Niles Paul looked kind of good last week. Now, that could be a product of them being down in that game. They had to throw. So Niles Paul was just a very easy way to get access to 3-yard passes, which Blake Bortles loves oh so much. But if he's going to be out there for like 50, 60% of the snaps, we know that the Dallas pass defense can get to the quarterback fairly quickly, that if Bortles needs to get the ball out fast, that Niles Paul could be an option for like 6, 7, 8 targets here.
Yeah, I think, Niles Paul, him and O'Shaughnessy both are kind of in that mix with ASJ out. It's just really tough to predict. O'Shaughnessy had less targets last week, but actually more of the air yards. He had 10% versus 9% for Paul. But it might be a little bit of a trap just because Jacksonville threw for over 400 yards last week playing against that defense of Kansas City that's really bad, and playing against that offense of Kansas City, which makes you score. Dallas, I think, is the complete opposite kind of team. They're a team that, almost like Miami, they're going to feed the ball to Zeke, probably not run too many plays, and not force you to score too many points. So, I don't think I'm on those guys as much this week. I think I'd look for, maybe a guy like Ricky Seals-Jones. No one's going to touch him going against, coming off, zero catches on 6 targets last week. And to top it off, he's going against the Minnesota Vikings defense. But I think if you are looking to exploit the Minnesota Vikings defense, one of the things you can do is kind of get in base personnel and get a tight end matched up against one of their kind of base personnel linebackers. We saw Zach Ertz last week go for 10 catches on 11 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown. So I think Seals-Jones is like an interesting contrarian play. He'll probably be 2% or less owned.
All right, defenses to close this out. I have one defense, and I'm thinking about playing them in 100% of lineups, which I did once, and it didn't work out whatsoever. It actually kind of killed my week, so maybe I'll back off that stance a little bit. The Cardinals are $2,000 against the Vikings. The Vikings have a terrible offensive line. The Vikings love to pass, play one of the fastest paces. So Cousins is going to be dropping back 35-plus times here, regardless of what the score, even the fact that they are 10-point favorites. And Arizona has one of the best attacking defensive lines in all of football. I expect them to be scored on. That's a thing that happens. But even if they give up like 21 or 24 points, they're going to have ample opportunity to generate a sack floor in this game. If they can get to Cousins, Cousins can make bad decisions. And if they can pressure him around like 8 to 10 times in this game, that could lead to a turnover. Turnovers can lead to touchdowns. And the return game is always pretty solid, that if we're talking about a week where you have to save money somewhere, that seems like the most logical option to me to save money.
Yeah, I think they're going to be, they actually pop in my fantasy labs model as the number one defense to play. And that's just, like you said, going off the price. I think I wouldn't play them in 100% because I think a lot of what's happened with Minnesota this year has kind of been game script specific. So they faced a lot of good offenses in situations where they ended up having to throw regardless because their defense hasn't been as good. And this is a game against Arizona where they could conceivably actually, jump out to a lead and kind of hold on to it and potentially not have to, even if they're not running a ton because they're not confident in their run game. Now, I did mention, Arizona is terrible against running backs as well. So maybe you do see more backs, but Minnesota could kind of, throw shorter passes, get the ball out a little quicker and kind of mitigate some of the things that have been happening to over these past few weeks. So I don't think they're like 100%, but I do agree. I think especially at the ownership, you're probably going to get them at one of the top plays on the board this week.
Other than that, like the other two pay down defenses that I can kind of see, almost any week, as long as the Texans don't score 50 points on you, Deshaun Watson's getting sacked like 6 times. So the Bills, they're going to slow the game down. It's not an ideal spot. Maybe the Cowboys are a better spot against Blake Bortles at 2,300.
Yeah, I think the Bills are actually, an interesting defense. I mean, like, let's look at what they've done in 2 of the past 3 weeks. They've scored at least 12 DraftKings points. They had that big game against Minnesota where they held Minnesota to 6 points, got 4 sacks, 3 turnovers. And then, against the Titans, they hold them to 12 points. Now, that's not hard to do, but they get, another couple of sacks, 3 more turnovers. So I think this Bills defense, you mentioned it. Deshaun Watson is going to eat some sacks. He's also liable to throw some picks. So I think Buffalo in a spot now, it'd be ideal if it was in Buffalo. I worry a little bit about them traveling to Houston for this game, but I think that's definitely a situation that you want some exposure to as well, just because of the Watson's liability to take sacks. I think an interesting one is the Baltimore Ravens. They're at 2,800 against the Titans. Now, you never know kind of what you're going to get out of the Titans, but this is a Titans team that in any given week, they can really lay an egg on offense. And we saw the Ravens, even in a game against Cleveland where they end up losing the football game, they still score double-digit DraftKings points. They get 5 sacks. They haven't allowed more than 14 points in the last 3 weeks. And they also played the Steelers and the Broncos, which are kind of various levels of offenses that they've done this to. So I think the Ravens there at 28 is kind of you kind of get some savings, but still that upside that you're looking for.
I guess if you're going to pay up at the position, are you looking at Houston and looking at Chicago, not all the way up to Minnesota or Jacksonville?
Yeah, Jacksonville just only because Dallas, again, run heavy team. So when you're using a defense, you actually would like if a team was forced to pass a little bit more. Dak Prescott, not that interception prone, and Dallas going to run a lot. So yeah, I think, this Buffalo offense has been just abysmal for the most part. I mean, aside from when they got the field position against Minnesota, thanks to their defense, they have not been able to get it going at all. So I think, Houston's in a really good spot. They've been a pass funnel, and Buffalo can't pass. So this should work out well for the Houston defense. And I think, Chicago as well, going there and the Rams. Let's not forget the Rams. I mean, this is a team that, because they can score so many points, they can make a team like Denver have to throw. And Case Keenum really hasn't been that good. I mean, he's got, 5 picks in 5 starts. So I think the Rams will kind of be a defense that, you can get at decent ownership as well that could put up a big number.
I guess the final one that I would consider, I don't know if they would make the final cut for me, but the Colts pass rush has been surprisingly decent this year, especially outside. They got to Wentz a bunch of times in Philadelphia a little bit earlier on in the season. They got to Deshaun Watson a whole bunch of times, which, like we just talked about, teams can do. But the Jets' offensive line is piss poor that if the Colts can jump up in this game, they're going to be a lot healthier than they were 10 days ago than we saw them in New England. That if Sam Darnold is put into a situation where he needs to pass 40 times in this game, that under pressure, yeah, he might not be the best. Not afraid to chuck a pick 6 or 2.
Yeah, I think they're definitely in play as a contrarian play. The only worry is that they're kind of like a road underdog, and the Colts. Andrew Luck historically tends to struggle on the road, and so it's kind of a situation where the odds of all those things happening are a little kind of stacked against you a little more than if they would be in Indianapolis. But Sam Darnold has been a guy that's been liable to turn the ball over. You just got to kind of hope that, like you said, the Colts are able to get up and the Jets are able to run it down their throat like they were against Denver.
All right, Chris Raybon, actionnetwork.com. Let us know what is coming up from you later on this week.
Yeah, so I have, Action Network, Fantasy Labs is under our umbrella, and I do slate breakdowns for every single slate. So main slate, 1 p.m., 4 p.m., Sunday night showdown, Thursday night showdown, Monday night showdown. The Thursday night one is free every week, and the other ones are for premium lab subscribers, so you can check all those out. And then I do a bunch of stuff on Action Network for our NFL game previews, just on bets I like, mismatches I see in certain games. So look out for all that. And of course, we got the Action Network NFL podcast coming out on Friday with myself and Matthew Friedman, and then the recap coming out on Monday with myself and Ian Harditz.
I did want to ask you, do you have any particular insight to what I should be doing on the Showdown slate? Have you seen, with the new captain spot, any trends really emerge here?
Yes. So on the Showdown slates on DraftKings, because you have to pay for that 1.5x. So what you want to do here is you want to kind of find, you don't want to necessarily just say, look at the highest upside guy, the highest price guy, and say, okay, this is the guy I'm locking in because he has the most upside. Actually, what you want to do is you want to find the guy who is in that middle to lower tier, whose ceiling, who can kind of match the ceiling of some of those upside guys. So, for example, a guy like, let's say on the last slate, like Kiki was a guy who we knew could get like 100 yards and a touchdown. You actually want to look at him in that. I know Hopkins, I think, ended up being the play, but like, for example, you would look at a guy like him. I think Vance McDonald in that Bucks Steelers game on Monday night a few weeks ago, he was the guy you ended up meeting in the captain spot. Cooper Kupp in that Vikings Rams game. So, look for those guys in that middle tier that will give you that have the same ceiling as the guys in the upper tier, and then just kind of build around that. Usually you want to kind of skew toward the passing games. Mentioned opposing quarterbacks are highly correlated. So anytime you can get both quarterbacks in the lineup, in your lineup, it's usually a good thing. And then, those are, I think, the two keys. Is, don't overspend on that captain spot, and try to get your passing game stacks in order, and find your leverage there. Like, if, for example, you have a receiver like, let's say, Vance McDonald a couple of weeks ago. Okay, well, if he puts up a big game, who does that affect most? Probably Antonio Brown, because Antonio Brown is so expensive that if Vance McDonald outscores him, number one, you're going to need Vance in the captain spot probably, and number two, Brown might not be a necessary play. So just kind of always think about those correlations in that way.
So is there if you pay for the mid-tier guy, put him in your captain spot, does that now mean that you have the money to jam in both quarterbacks? And should you be playing both quarterbacks on every slate?
I wouldn't say in 100% of lineups, no, but I would say that you do want to do it because I mentioned opposing quarterbacks have a correlation of 0.59, which, especially when we're talking about the NFL, is a relatively strong correlation there. So you want to do it more than the field does it, and the field tends to not always necessarily do it that much, or to the level of which they are correlated. So definitely want to kind of have more exposure to those kind of lineups than the field. But you're still kind of constructing lineups based on what you think is going to happen for the outcome of the game. So maybe in a situation like Dallas Houston, you're not doing it as much. You're kind of going where you're going Dak or you're going Zeke, and you're kind of building lineups that way with the Houston players either way. So it still depends on the slate, but I'd say, you definitely want to have lineups where you do have exposure to both quarterbacks in the same lineup, because from a correlation standpoint, and just if you just look at projections, projected floor, projected ceiling, even if a quarterback doesn't necessarily stand out on that slate as a given play, he's usually going to be a top 2 or top 3 kind of raw projection, ceiling projection or whatnot. So you definitely want to kind of get those guys in your lineup.
What's the viability of defenses and kickers in this sort of format? They seem like safe points, maybe cash game plays, but if you're playing in a tournament and you're not playing like 150 lineups or even 20 lineups, let's say you're playing 5, do you need to roll the defenses through that if the game total is over like 48?
I think it really depends on, again, on the slate. So you mentioned it. You're correct in that. They're more viable in cash games. In tournaments, defenses tend to be a little bit more viable than kickers because they have the upside of scoring touchdowns and even multiple touchdowns, and even though it doesn't happen too much. So with defenses and kickers, I think their biggest use comes in not as like guys you're trying to jam in or play because you think they're in a good spot, as much as you want to kind of use them when, let's say, there's 5 guys, there's 5 other guys, and you kind of like the way those 5 guys correlate. And then you have a 6th spot to fill, and you're deciding between a few options, and the defense or the kicker happens to be one of them. That's a situation where then you kind of leverage their price points to kind of play, because a lot of times you'll be looking at a kicker or a defense, and they'll be projected for more points than, let's say, a tight end or a wide receiver in that same salary range, that 2 or 3K or lower 4K range. So that's kind of when you want to use them, when you're really kind of using them to get 5 other guys that you feel really good about or that you really couldn't get in any other way.
Finally, what do we do with those like $400 players? Like if they're going to be on the field, do you just play them, or is everyone kind of doing that so you fade it? And when it comes down to like just the dart throws, like we saw Eldrick Robinson break a slate that you needed to have him. Even someone like Josh Hill in that Monday night game with New Orleans. Hey, he ends up with a touchdown. He's unowned. He's super cheap, and it allows you to jam in every other single top-end play, the top-end chalk to differentiate yourself. So should you be looking at those like sub-$1,000 guys if they're going to be on the field? And should you be trying to actively take a dart throw in each of these lineups if you actually want to win a GPP, not just place?
I would say that, well, first of all, on these one-game slates, there's no kind of like rigid auto fade or auto play strategy because it's just too small. And there's too many possibilities. Anything could happen. So I don't think you want to kind of say, okay, I'm automatically fading or playing any type. But I think, yes, you do always want to look at every play that's going to be on the field, on the slate. And that's something I do, in the breakdowns over at Fantasy Labs. I actually recommended Aldrick that night he went off because I was just looking and, when you looked at it, you said, okay, this guy's going to be on the field for, he only played, I think it was 9 snaps the week before, but you look at Raquan Treadwell was struggling, and Aldrick is a guy, high air yard guy. I think, 2/3 of his touchdowns have come from like 35 or more yards out. So anytime you find a situation like that where that guy has like legitimate upside, I think you definitely want to put him in your lineup. I don't think you need a guy like that in every lineup, because then you're kind of creating lineups in one type of way, and you don't always see a guy like that in the winning lineup. So it's really a case by case basis based on the upside in the given slate. So I think you had Maurice Harris there in single digits, and he was going to start. He ended up getting 8 targets. Josh Hill, I think, was a little more expensive, but it really comes down to, how many snaps, how many targets, what kind of air yards are they getting? That's always good, because air yards, the thing with air yards is that they're kind of unrealized yardage. So the price isn't going to go up, but if they're getting the air yards, that's always a good situation to take a chance. Or red zone targets, same thing. I talked about Hill for that exact reason, was that, this guy, he's liable to just catch a touchdown. If he does, that's a touchdown that, Kamara doesn't score, or Ingram doesn't score, or Michael Thomas doesn't score. So you want to think about it in leverage situations. Maybe if you play one of those guys, you think about how they affect the rest of the slate too. Like who would they affect? Like if a guy like Josh Adams for the Eagles, the running back, it pays off at 900. Who does that affect? Probably Wendell Smallwood or somebody like that. So maybe you fade Smallwood in lineups where you play Adams. Things like that are how you want to approach those guys on a case by case basis.
Is that the biggest mistake that people make in these showdown slates, is not telling themselves the story of how the game unfolds when they make their picks?
I think so, because, let's be real. There are, even though you have the multiple lineups and it's just a one-game slate, so you feel like you have all these possibilities. You can only play, so you still have a limit of how many lineups you can play. And I think a lot of people aren't playing they aren't playing 150 lineups on every slate or whatnot. So you do want to have a way to kind of narrow it down to what you feel is a sound play. And I think one of the ways to do that is you only have a 6-man lineup, so you need to kind of tell yourself the story of how these 6 players fit together and arrive at a score that would outscore every other lineup. So for example, if you put let's say a quarterback in the captain spot and he's like the most expensive player on the slate, well, you have to look at his receivers, because if you're saying, hey, this quarterback is at the most expensive price is going to be worth it in the captain slot where I'm paying an extra 1.5, for him. That means he's probably going to have to get some rushing touchdowns, because if he's just throwing the ball all over the yard to his receivers and his receivers are all cheaper, there's a much better chance that one of those cheaper receivers will actually be, have similar or better value than that quarterback. And then you need that receiver in that captain spot and not the quarterback. So you have to kind of talk through, in your head, kind of how you would be able to arrive, your lineup would be able to arrive at the highest score, and not just kind of blindly just, throw guys in with no rhyme or reason.
All right, that'll do it on the Pat Mayo Experience, Week 6, DraftKings picks and preview. Thank you for helping me break down, or actually just telling me the strategy behind the Showdown Slate, because I've been struggling with it. I know a lot of people are trying to wrap their minds around it, so thanks a lot for that. Chris Raybon, follow him on Twitter at Chris Raybon. You can follow me at ThePME on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can hit up the cheat sheet in the description to this video or up on DKPlaybook.com. For DraftKings purposes, I'll be back on Friday for an ownership breakdown, then live Sunday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the DraftKings YouTube channel. I do want to let everyone know the odds and lines are subject to change. See the website for actual odds. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem and wants help, call 1-800-GAMBLER. I'm Pat Mayo. Good luck in Week 6. And if you want to get in the draw for 20 DK dollars, give the episode a like, leave your DraftKings handle, tell me which running back you prefer under $4,500 on the DraftKings main slate this week. All right? Someone go William, win $1 million, whether it be Showdown or in the Millie Maker, okay? Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!